All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar. We're very happy to have you joining us as we're having a conversation around data in the school to prison pipeline entitled Make It Make Sense, what data tells us about the school to prison pipeline. And this program this evening is a part of a week-long actions and activities and events sponsored as a part of the Dignity in Schools campaign and their National Week of Action Against School Pushout. So this is one of just many events taking place over this week. So we encourage you to check them out. And the organization that is sponsoring tonight's webinar is the Intercultural Development Research Association. We are an independent nonprofit based in San Antonio, Texas. Our mission is to achieve equal educational opportunity for every child through strong public schools that prepare all students to access and succeed in college. We strengthen and transform public education by providing training, research, evaluation, and frameworks for action, policy analyses, and innovative materials and programs. And so from that vantage point, we're going to be talking to you all a little bit today about the school to prison pipeline, and really thinking about how data can help us impact the school to prison pipeline. So before we get into that, we're happy to have all of you all. We want to tell you who we are. So I will start by introducing myself. My name is Terrence Wilson. I am IDRA's Regional Policy and Community Engagement Director. I originally started my career as an attorney, and part of my work was representing young people in disciplinary actions. And so from that work, I started to realize that over and over again, there were certain commonalities that I could see among the things that were happening to my students that I was representing. And so I think it's really important for us to be able to turn our own experiences, figure out what the data says, and I'm very excited for you all to hear more about how we can do that together this evening. And we will get back to that, but before we do that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Bricio Vasquez.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Bricio Vasquez. I'm also with the Intercultural Development Research Association. And a little bit about my background. So I am the data scientist with IDRA. I work primarily on the policy advocacy and community engagement arm of our organization. And I've been working in education as an analyst and researcher for about 10 years now. And so one of the things that I like to do is work with data and to identify patterns that we consistently see in education. And so this webinar today is centered around the school to prison pipeline. And importantly, one of the things that we recently did, along with one of our interns this summer, is do an analysis on how out-of-school suspension leads to higher rates of high school non-completion. So that's what we're going to start talking about today. So we're going to talk about that research that we conducted over the summer, and then after that, we'll talk about some other data points. We have a couple of dashboards that we want to show you. The first dashboard is going to be on general school discipline. And then the second one after that is going to be on corporal punishment. And so both Terrence and I will sort of look at the data and have a conversation about some of the things that we observe in the numbers, and then also how that ties to a much broader problematic concept of the school to prison pipeline. So let's get started. One of the things that I will point you to is our IDRA newsletter. This is a monthly newsletter that we publish here at IDRA, and you can subscribe to it if you're not already subscribed to it with the link down below. And we will also put that on the Facebook live chat so that you can just copy and paste it. But you'll get these monthly newsletters that we write on the range of different issues. September was focused on school discipline. And one of those articles was written by one of our summer interns, Lola Solis, who is a master's student at Berkeley. And she worked with us over the summer on a number of different projects, but this is one of the projects that she focused on. Both Terrence and I have been talking about doing some kind of analysis that tied school discipline to educational outcomes. We know that in the broader scheme of things, there's a connection between school discipline and entering the criminal justice system. But before that, we believe that school discipline, and in particular disproportionate school discipline, affects school outcomes. So the article written by Lola Solis focused on this. How are educational outcomes shaped by school discipline? And so we use Texas as our primary, as our state that we focused on. So let's talk a little bit about the data. Oh, I should mention, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We do have folks monitoring the chat on Facebook, and they'll give us those questions as we're rolling along. So please feel free to engage in this conversation along with us. So the main question we had when we were writing this article was, do out-of-school suspensions lead to lower graduation rates? We focused on out-of-school suspensions for a number of reasons. One, it's an exclusionary practice. It takes students out of their regular educational environment, which leads to learning loss. It leads to losing connections with both the faculty and staff at the school. It leads to losing connections with students. It's stigmatizing, and there's a number of other, problematic outcomes that stem from out-of-school discipline. And so we asked the question: quite simply, are graduation rates affected by this? Does this lead to school dropouts? And so we wanted to tie this into the broader sort of concept of the school-to-prison pipeline. We know that this doesn't sort of happen automatically, but we understand that schools have a role to play in ameliorating this process. So in order to address this question, well, first, regarding the conceptual framework of our study, again, we argue that out-of-school suspensions lead to high school non-completion. And so it's important to frame this as high school non-completion rather than school dropouts. Our analysis is at the school district level, not at the student level. And so we are seeking to understand how a school district, right, this entity, contributes through their characteristics, right? And so if we think about school districts as, these entities, then a rate or a percentage of one of either of these is a characteristic of the school district, and arguably the school district can take steps to minimize high school non-completion through minimizing also out-of-school suspensions. So we believe this is how the process works. Out-of-school suspensions lead to high school non-completion, but what adds some complexity to this story is that race, ethnicity, and economic disadvantage also play a role. In this case, we argue that the race, ethnicity, and economic disadvantage play a mediating role in leading to high school non-completion. So we control for race, ethnicity, and economic disadvantage in this study.
And so, Bricio, before you go on, so the study does not try to say that folks that are of a particular race or a particular economic disadvantage just more likely to be, to not complete their graduation. It's actually saying that this just plays a factor in explaining the relationship between out-of-school suspension and high school non-completion. Is that correct?
That's correct. So again, because the study is at the aggregate level, it's at the school district level, not at the individual level, right? We can't make the argument that these processes occur specifically as we're talking about them in individual students, right? But instead, we argue that perhaps, right, as an example, this mechanism might manifest itself as race and ethnicity playing a role, but partly because of discriminatory practices, racist practices within the schools that lead to the disproportionality in school discipline, rather than students themselves playing a role in this relationship.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I think it's really important for us when we're talking about the data to not have a deficit view of particular students, right? And I think that this data that we're going to show you helps us explain some of the systemic reasons why these students are impacted, but it's not a reflection of the capability or the deficiencies in any of those student groups that we're going to talk about. So I just wanted to say that at the beginning, and to always be careful when we're looking at data like this to make sure that we're examining what we're really trying to say about that. So thank you for clarifying that, Bricia. We can keep moving on.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the data we used. We, again, used aggregate data. So everything, the primary unit here is the school district. And we're also focusing on Texas. So this analysis isolates Texas. It does not include any of the other states. So we use the 2017-18 Civil Rights Data Collection, the CRDC, and we link that to TEA high school completion data. In this case, high school dropout data or high school non-completion. We used public schools only and excluded charter schools and charter districts, mainly because we believe there's probably a different process there. And also a lot of the charter districts are smaller. And so it leads to the other problem that we encountered with this analysis, that a lot of the Texas data have missing values in the variables that we were interested in. So out of the 1,204 school districts or local education agencies in the state of Texas, we limited our sample to 342 school districts that had complete data for all of the variables that we were interested in. Method, quite simply, we use good old-fashioned ordinary least square regression to predict the rate of high school completion. Our key predictor variable in this case was the school district percentage of out-of-school suspensions. And our outcome variable, or the variable that we're interested in that's going to be changed by the out-of-school suspension, is the school district percentage high school non-completion. So the rate of students that did not complete high school. We did log transform the variables just to adjust the distributions and apply this linear model. And then for our control variables, we used race and ethnicity and economically disadvantaged. So we included the percentage of the school district's enrollment, the school districts, the percentage of Black students in the school district, the percentage of white students, percentage of Hispanic students, and the percentage of students that fall in some other racial category. And then also the percentage of economically disadvantaged students. Though these variables were taken from the CRDC, and then the high school non-completion came from the TA data. So as you know, our main variables of interest here are out-of-school suspension. So about 2.1% is the median for the 342 school districts that were included in the data. So just as a refresher, the median, of course, is if we were to rank order all of the school districts from highest to lowest in percentage out-of-school suspensions, 2.1% falls right at the 50th percentile, right in the middle. So 50% of our distribution falls is above 2.1%, and 50% fall below the 2.1%. Similarly, we use the median for percentage of high school non-completion, which was 1.7. And this is what our relationship looks like. So this is a scatter plot. As you can see, there is a positive relationship between out-of-school suspensions and high school non-completion in Texas, within the 342 districts that we included in the analysis, meaning that as high school out-of-school suspensions increase, so do high school non-completion. And this relationship was statistically significant. So let me just talk a little bit about what this means. And these numbers probably don't make sense because they're log transformed. That's okay. Don't worry about what that means. What's important here is what this relationship looks like. So if we look at this dot right here, each dot represents a school district, right? And it's falling within the graph according to their values on out-of-school suspension and high school non-completion. So here in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, right, I'm highlighting this dot. This is a school district with very low, right, out-of-school suspensions, and they have a corresponding low rate of high school non-completion. And so if we compare that to school districts on the top right hand of the chart, it's showing us that, same thing, the school district has a very high rate of out-of-school suspension, and also has a high rate of high school non-completion. And you can see this pattern on the data throughout the 342 districts that we analyzed within this research. Yes, there are exceptions, right? So for example, I'm highlighting this school district in the top left-hand corner of the screen. And that's showing this school district has very high rates of out-of-school suspensions, but very low rates of high school non-completion, right? And so we have some like those. There is going to be variation in the analysis. But the important thing is that overall, the pattern seems to demonstrate that the out-of-school suspensions are associated with higher rates of high school non-completion. This is happening at the school district level. So just to talk a little bit more about the results and what they mean, we found a significant positive relationship between the district suspension rates and their high school non-completion. In plain terms, a 1% increase in the out-of-school suspension rate is associated with a 1.4% increase in high school non-completion, and that's holding everything constant, right? Race and ethnicity and economically disadvantaged. Additionally, because we did include control variables for race and ethnicity and economically disadvantaged, school districts with higher rates of or a higher proportion of Latinx students is also statistically significant, positively statistically significant. So a 1% increase in the percentage of Latinx students at a school district is associated with a 1.4% increase in high school non-completion. And then with the other category, there is a 1.1% increase in high school non-completion. So in other words, what we're seeing, if we go back to the out-of-school suspension and the and high school non-completion, in plain terms, school districts that suspend students at a higher rate also have a higher rate of high school non-completion. That is the overall message that we're taking from this analysis.
And I think, but before we go forward, I think it's important to just pause for a minute and think about that fact for the advocates on this in this conversation, right? So if you're thinking about, going to a school and trying to figure out how they can impact the school's out-of-school suspension rate, because we know suspension rate is also related to, being involved in the juvenile justice system. I think this is an important data point that you can use, right? A lot of the schools are ostensibly, or they say that they're set up, right, to be preparing students for that next stage of success, right? And so part of that is completing high school. And so one of the ways that you can make sure that this is relevant to all of the administrators and leaders in your school or school district is say, you know that there's a relationship between how many students we're suspending, how high our suspension rate is, and whether or not students are going to be completing high school. And so if you all care about having students complete high school, and it's really important for us to think about reducing the number of suspensions. We at IDRA believe it's really important just in and of itself that we're not suspending students using exclusionary disciplinary practices that do not work. But I think that it's also important for us to speak the language of some of our school leaders, right? And there's other studies that show the impact of suspension on other aspects, right? Our study, we're talking a little bit more about high school completion, but there's other studies that show the impact on academic success, the impact on feeling a part of the school, right? A lot of different areas that out of school suspensions have an impact on. And it's one of the things, the justifications that you can bring to your school leaders if they say, no, our job is to teach. Our job is to prepare students academically. And you can retort it, you can say back to them that you can't educate effectively, you can't be successful in your job of educating students if you're using these exclusionary disciplinary practices. So I think it's just important for us to always have that eye to, how we can talk to those folks who are in positions of leadership in our schools and our school boards, and for us to be able to take data to them that's going to resonate with the things that they think are important. So this is just one example, but I think it's something that is really important for us to keep in mind as we're being advocates and trying to close the school-to-prison pipeline.
Yeah, well said, Terrence. I'm thinking of the Equity Assistance Center convening that we had this summer. And one of our speakers said something that resonated with me. And I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't thought of it so plainly and so simply. You want to graduate students, keep them in school, right? Out of school suspension literally takes a child out of their learning environment. How are they going to learn, and how is the teacher going to do their job to educate that student if they're not even there, right? And so I think this kind of speaks to this research that we did does sort of speak to the obvious, right? But it is a data-driven way to show evidence towards these processes actually happening. Also, I will say that this is and again, I'll reiterate this is an analysis done at the school district level. So these are characteristics of the school district that are driving these processes at the systemic level, right? We're not observing individual students and their experience. These are school districts that have, right? And they're relative to each other. Some school districts have higher rates than others. So the leadership and faculty and staff are doing something that's driving these numbers, right? And so how can those be mitigated, right? How can those differences in rates lead to positive educational outcomes with students? Just because I am, trying to cover my bases here, there are limitations to the study. First, I think the sample size does not reflect the entire state, right? We were able to use 342 school districts, which is about 28% of the total Texas number of school districts and local education agencies, including charter schools in all of Texas. So this is a limitation. We're not observing all of the school districts that we would like to, right? And part of that, and that doesn't have anything to do with size. There are missing data elements in the TEA data. But recently, TEA has started to actually randomize the values that they exclude from their data to prevent multiple imputation. So it's a little bit harder to include more school districts just because of the things that have changed with TEA. Nevertheless, 342 is still a substantial sample that we can use in the analysis, but it still is a limitation. Also, because of missingness, we are lacking essential control variables. So we would have liked to include variables like what is the proportion of students we would have liked to include the proportion of students that receive special education services. We would also have liked to include the proportion of students that receive bilingual education. But again, because we had to use rows or school districts with complete data, we lost a lot of that. And increasing the number of variables would have actually decreased our sample size.
And one other question for you, Bricio, is whether or not, so this analysis, you spoke about the differences based on economic disadvantage and around race, ethnicity. Did you also include gender? We had a question around whether you saw any differences in terms of subgroup of males versus females.
That's a great question. And in this particular analysis, we did not control for the sex of the students. But the data that we're going to see here in a minute does have those differences. We do disaggregate by sex in the dashboards. And so this is something that we need to think about. This is another limitation, right? We know that that males tend to receive higher rates of disproportionate disciplinary application versus their female counterparts, right? And so I think that's an important variable to include, and it also contributes to the limitations of the study that we did.
And one more point just before we leave is also, you know, one of the things that struck me when you presented to me about this study was the particular impact on Latino students. And we had an other category of students, right? And so I was wondering, just make sure before we leave it, in case anyone was confused, that other category was some of the other smaller racial ethnic identities to a more racist collapse into one. Is that correct?
Right. So in the data for the race ethnicity variable and well, for the race ethnicity, that actually came from the CRDC. And because some of the numbers in the Native American and Alaskan Native category, Asian and Pacific Islander categories, they're very small. And so we collapsed them into a single category. And students also that check multiple races are collapsed into a single category, the other category, just so we are able to increase our numbers. That is also a limitation. We know that there are probably differences by within those racial categories. And so that's something that we could look into a little bit deeper in future research efforts. Yeah, so another limitation that I didn't write on here, it's only Texas, right? And it would be nice to conduct a similar analysis for all school districts across the United States. And so, you know, that's something that we're looking into. We know that each state has a different set of policies and laws that dictate educational practices. And so doing an analysis on the entire United States would actually help us understand that a little bit better.
And we have an opportunity to, for those folks who say, well, what's the data picture look like in our state? We do have an opportunity to show you all a little bit about some of the data that we've made available that might help you answer some of the questions about your own state. So we can get into that piece of it if you would like to at this point.
Cool, let's do it. All right, so what other data sources can you peruse via IDRA's websites? Well, we have a number of different dashboards that we've created over time, and you can actually click on one of our links in the Facebook chat that will take you to our corporal punishment website, and there's a link for our corporal punishment dashboard on there. But for now, I'll show you a couple of other. We'll walk through some other dashboards here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
And while Bricio is pulling up those dashboards, I think, you know, it's important for us to realize that a lot of this data, although it does, Bricio mentioned quite a bit, you know, a few limitations, but I think a lot of these trends, if you look at data across the country, you'll see a lot of similarities. So don't think that just because we found this in Texas, if you're not in Texas, that it doesn't apply to you, right? That is a limitation of this particular study, but if you're diligent, you can look and see what the data and research looks like in your area. There are lots of different ways for you to find that too. So with that, I'll kick it back over to Bricio.
All right, so the link that you received on the Facebook Live chat will take you to our corporal punishment page. And then on there, you can go to the dashboard, directly into the dashboard on corporal punishment. But before we get into corporal punishment, we're going to look at the general regional school discipline dashboard. And that is this one right here. Again, we're using CRDC data. The most recent data available for the CRDC, the Civil Rights Data Collection, is 2017-2018. And what we've done here is we compiled a lot of the discipline data, which includes school-related arrests, expulsion rates, in-school suspensions, and out-of-school suspensions. So we're going to look at the out-of-school suspension dashboard. And so right now we're looking at New York and Texas. And in both of these states, Black males, right? So this addresses now the question that was posited earlier. Did we look at the differences between sex within these schools? Not in the previous analysis, but if you go to our dashboards, you can see how that, you can see those patterns disaggregated by sex. And so Black males in general have higher rates of school discipline, but in most states, Black males are the disproportionate recipients of these exclusionary disciplinary practices. So right now we're looking at Texas and New York. If you hover over the bars, you'll see the numbers that correspond to the rates. So this is about 19% of males in Texas, Black males in Texas, have received out-of-school suspension in the 2017-2018 academic year. And so we're looking at the proportion of the total student subgroup. So this is about 19%, meaning that out of every 100 Black male students in Texas, 19 of them are likely to get an out-of-school suspension, compared to, here is the white male, right? And that is just under 10%, right? Just under 10% of white males in Texas will get an out-of-school suspension, right? And if we compare that by sex, you know, we have around 19% for Black males, and then for Black females, the percentage is above, a little bit above 10%. So, you know, 10 out of every 100 Black female students in Texas experience corporal punishment. You can see these disparities by sex in all racial and ethnic categories, right? So Hispanic males almost double that of Hispanic females. You know, white males more than double compared to white females. And that is the case for almost all states. And so what I'm going to do now is, go ahead, Terrence.
And I was going to say, I think that so looking at the orange bars, right, that represent all the different categories of female students, you can also see that Black girls, right, receive the highest amongst their other, students that are also female. So I think that it's, important that we, obviously we look at the ones who are most disproportionately impacted by these things, but also realize it's not just Black males, it's also Black females. And really we're thinking about, right, the fairness of these tools and not a reflection of, how troublesome Black males are related to these other groups, right? We're positing that looking at these this data overall is giving us a picture of the strategies that we use to address behavior, and that it's not really reflective of differences in individual student behavior, right? Students all over the country of all different ethnicities, genders, whatever, they act a certain way, but the question is how we respond to that behavior, whether it's in a supportive or using discipline as a tool. So I just want to make sure I reiterate, and looking at these numbers, this does not indicate that, Black boys and Black girls are, more likely to be doing things to get suspended. It's more a reflection that they're more likely to have that outcome because of the choice made and how to respond to that behavior that they exhibit. So I just wanted to mention that, as well as looking at, making sure that we're seeing that not only the boys have the highest number of all the students, but also the girls as well compared to the other girls. So I think it's just important for us to think about that too. But go ahead, Brisa, you were going to show us how the trend looks across the region.
Right. So here we have, if I unselect all other states, I can isolate. Actually, I'll just go here first. Something funny is going to happen. Just bear with me here in a second. And so now, okay, so we're looking now at, so I know that the bars are very tiny and you can barely see, the writing. But one of the things that we wanted to point out here is how the consistency across the southern states for how Black males experience discipline in these southern states. So these tall blue bars are all related to Black males. And again, I'll reiterate that this is not a consequence of Black students actually being more problematic, but instead it's a reflection of the state or the school district's approach to discipline. Would you agree to that, Terrence?
I would. And it really does help, when we're working with our students and families who've experienced, something that they didn't feel like was fair. This is something that you can point to. There are ways for you to look at this data in your own school. A lot of schools and a lot of states publish this similar kind of data, right, where you can look at it and see, but it really helps them support the experience that they're having. A lot of this data tells us a story and tells decision makers a story. And part of that is that, students who feel like they are targeted more often, the data actually backs them up more often than not when it comes to discipline. So I think it's a very useful tool for us to be able to understand, what groups we need to focus on. If we're thinking about equity, right, we need to make sure that we're addressing the students who are receiving this outcome more often than others. And it also just goes to show the disproportionality, right? If all things are held equal, there's really no reason that Black students should be disciplined 2 or 3 times the rate of white students, or Latino students be disciplined more. And so I think that it's good for us to understand and know so that we can address these problems, right? Without the data, we can think, oh, what happened to me was an outlier. What happened to me isn't the typical practice. And this data actually shows us that that's true across an entire state, right? And across an entire region. I think it's reflective of the approach that we've taken to to student behavior and the strategies and the policies that we've created, such that we rely on exclusionary disciplinary practices versus some others. So it's important for us to think about what are some of the things that we can do differently. And I think Mauricio is going to talk a little bit more about one of the policies that that we're still using, like out of school suspensions, that we know is not helpful, right? We've shown some of the relationship to graduation and other things, right? There are other things that we know are not helpful for students in terms of our approach and the policies that we choose. And so I don't know if you want to say anything more about this one, Bricia, before we move to the corporal punishment, but I think it does reflect not just on students, but really on us as a region. So let's, did you want to add anything else to that, Bricia, around school discipline, out of school suspensions?
Well, so the only thing I would add is that we also have the aggregated numbers at the national level, so you can compare them to the the national average here in the little table above the graph, and then you can see how your state in particular compares to the national average. We also have a table for our Equity Assistance Center region, which consists of 12 southern states, and the District of Columbia, which is a region that the IDRA Equity Assistance Center assists and provides professional development and a number of different resources for schools wanting to observe or understand equity at their school district or their school. Okay, so let's move on to corporal punishments. So corporal punishments is still practiced across the United States. I believe it's 19 different states in the US that still use violence to discipline their children. I always like to sort of make a comparison for corporal punishment. I think there's probably a number of people that don't know or don't believe that this is still happening in school districts. And then there's another sort of, and I'm generalizing based on an experience I had in a presentation I did down in the Rio Grande Valley. But then there's also people that believe it's effective, right? And these people probably don't know anything. They don't work in education. They probably don't know anything about how this happens. But I always like to make the comparison anytime that I encounter somebody that seems to think this is an appropriate way to address discipline. It's violence against students. And if you compare it to, say, it happening in the workplace, imagine if your coworker gets paddled because they didn't turn in a report on time. That would probably get the person sent to jail or arrested, right? And so, but we think it's okay for that to happen in schools, right? And indeed, in a lot of the southern states, corporal punishment is not only practiced but relied upon quite a bit to discipline students. And again, we see that in general, Black students tend to be the recipients of are more likely to receive corporal punishment in these places than other students. We make the same argument that we did before, that this is a consequence of school districts relying on sort of tradition or discriminatory practices to target Black students, but the data shows a consistent sort of disproportionality with corporal punishment as it does with out-of-school suspensions.
And I think it's just important for folks to know that, like, if you're in one of these states that, still practices corporal punishment, that there a lot of other states have been moving to remove, the ability for students to do this. There have been lots of recent laws passed. There's even federal legislation that's been introduced, right? So I think this is one of those issues, as if you're an advocate, that you can continue to push on. If you are in one of these states, this is where you can put a lot of the energy in, as we're mentioning, data and research. A lot of the data and research shows the negative impact, right, of corporal punishment practices in schools. And so I think that it's important for us to see, again, the disproportionality and also realize that these things have an impact on our ability to successfully educate students.
Yeah, and so here in Texas, we still use corporal punishment. Mississippi certainly does. And so on a caveat on this dashboard, we do have some states that made their way into the dashboard, but don't actually have any instances of corporal punishment. And so that might be a little confusing. Just know that if you're playing around with this dashboard, that may happen. You may get one that has 0 all across the board. Cool. All right. So
excellent. So
Terrence, take it away.
I will take it from here. So, we've talked a lot about the data picture and getting a sense of what this looks like kind of in Texas, what this looks like across the region. But we really wanted it to be important for you all to figure out how to make it make sense in your own community, right? Because we believe all students deserve safe and welcoming schools, right, that are not relying on harmful exclusionary discipline or school police to punish young people, right? The object of this week of action is talking about school push out. And so it's important for us as advocates, right? That's one of my roles. Bricio is a great researcher, the great brain behind a lot of our policy. But I'm an advocate, I'm out here trying to work with the communities to help them change some of these policies. And so it's important for you all. I'm going to give you a couple of tips about some policy implications, some policy things that we mentioned, in addition to limiting exclusionary discipline like out of school suspension and obviously eliminating corporal punishment. But one of the things that I would invite you all to do is to not just rely on research like what you saw Bricia present today, right? These, very complicated studies with regressions and, statistical relationships is really good. But also what's really important is for you all to be able to go into your own communities and do your own research. And that can be something as simple as, asking your friends. We work with a group of students. They asked their fellow students on Instagram, right? They did a poll question with their fellow students. That was one way of collecting research. You're able to go out and do surveys in the community, right? You're able to have focus groups or have conversations. And the purpose of all of this research is to be able to inform the folks that are in leadership at your school, in your school district, right, at your state legislature, right, all of these different places. You want them to be able to know what the voice is and what the concerns are of the communities that are there. And so you can be creative with the ways you can do your own research. You don't have to have a research background. All it really takes is connecting with people and capturing whatever you find, being able to put it together in a way that you can present it to folks who are in leadership in your school. And really, the more folks you can bring into this, the better. And there are a lot of different ways for you to do this, right? There's participatory action research that has structures, and there's all kinds of things you can find on the internet about different approaches. But the main purpose behind all of this is to help inform policy and practice. And so there are a couple of things, that two really main buckets of information that I think relates to school discipline that I think is really important for us to think about in terms of the school to prison pipeline. First is if you're in a state that has not raised the age for juvenile court jurisdiction, which means, if you are in a lot of states, in some states, if you're 16, in a lot of states, if you're 17 and you're treated as an adult in terms of what happens to you if you get in trouble. And so we've been, one of the things you can do to limit the school to prison pipeline is to raise the age so that those 16, 17, even 18-year-olds who are still in high school are not going to be subjected to adult punishment. We obviously believe that you shouldn't be relying on these exclusionary disciplinary practices anyway, but at least if you're having folks involved with the justice system, making sure that they're not dealing with the adult system, which has a whole nother host of problems than the juvenile court system. And I say at both ends because there's also instances where you've got young children who are having police called on them, children as young as 9 or 10 years old, right? You're a child. We don't think any child, right, should have to be in handcuffs and have to be exposed to that system, but especially not very young children. So I think it's important as a policy matter, if you're looking for different ways to impact this, it's obviously looking at discipline, but it's also looking at those policing practices that are sending our students directly into prison. And at the school level, I think it's really important to invest in restorative and supportive practices. Restorative practices is something that refers to things that schools can do as opposed to exclusionary discipline. It is a way of providing accountability for student actions that at the same time builds community and does not have a lot of the harmful impacts that we mentioned before. It's not associated with higher aspects or higher ratios of school non-completion or negative aspects in terms of your academic performance. So we think it's really important to think about what those restorative practices can be, as well as providing support for students, right? We all know that the pandemic has been tough, and then also there's a racial, injustice that students have been experiencing over the past year, and there's all different kinds of marginalizations in our schools that students need support to deal with. And I think it's important for us to note there was a recent study that showed that there are 1.7 million students in schools with police, but no counselors. There are 3 million students in schools with police, but no nurses. 6 million students in schools with police, but no psychologists. 10 million students in schools with police and no social workers. And 14 million students across the country are in schools that have police, but that don't have a counselor, a nurse, a psychologist, or a social worker. So we're treating symptoms of student behavior with police and not providing support. And so I think that that's a fundamentally flawed approach to addressing what's going on with our students, all the different ways that they're impacted by what's going on in the world today. And so it's important for having schools invest in a lot of these practices that are going to be able to be supportive and restorative for our schools and in our school communities. And the last piece of this that I will say, this is really important for you to not just take this knowledge and hold on to it, for you to take this knowledge and organize with your fellow community members, right? Whether you're in your own neighborhoods, right, or even in virtual communities where you find like-minded individuals, it's really important to provide that strength together and to organize each other to understand what the situation is in your schools. So often we talk to caregivers and parents, or we talk to students, and then they say, oh, I just didn't know that other people were experiencing this horrible thing that happened to me because it's discriminatory action because I wasn't talking to other people. I kind of held it in. So we think it's important to be loud and talking about what's happening with the situation in our schools. And then it's important for you to bring other people together to organize in your community. And it's important to strategize. So we've talked a little bit about one of the aspects that's important to changing policy and practice is talking about research and data, but there are other ways for you to strategize and prepare. Do you have the relationships with folks in power? Do you have a way to communicate with folks in leadership, right? Do you have allies that you can call on that can help you navigate these certain spaces, right? So there are lots of different strategies. What kind of messaging are you using to talk to people, right? As we mentioned before, talking about how these things play into this academic success and into graduation, right? Are you using the best messages to really cultivate interest from those folks who have a position of leadership in your schools and school district? And then then the last piece of this is really mobilize, right? So like part of this is making sure that once you got all the research, once you establish your relationships, that you don't sit on that information, that you're using this information to show up and to be at the table when these decisions are being made, that you're talking to your principal, that you're talking to your school board members, that you're talking to your state legislators, right? Because ultimately they work for you. As a student, they work for you. As a parent or caregiver, they work for you. And even as a community member, they work for you, right? A lot of our taxes go to support what's going on in the schools. And so we have a say in what happens there. So it's important for us to make sure that we allow our voices to be heard and that we're prepared to do so and that we mobilize together in our school district. So I saw that we have a couple of questions that we can try to just talk through before we finish. One of the questions that we received that said, I'm a graduate student pursuing research on hypercriminalization of Black girls in schools. May I know where to access this research? So, Bricio, you want to take on that question?
Yes. So the work that we just talked about, there's two places. The analysis on out-of-school suspension and high school not completion can be found on our newsletter. It's our September newsletter, and if it's available on our website, but you can also subscribe to receive these in your email, or you could actually receive a physical copy if you'd like. We still do that. A lot of people really like the physical newsletter. So that's one. That article appears in the September newsletter, and the entire newsletter is the theme is school discipline. For the dashboards, the data that you just saw, the source data is the CRDC, which is a federal data set. It's released every 2 years. But the dashboards themselves, you can also find them on our website. And if you scroll through the comments in the Facebook comments, there are links to both of those. The other question was about the slides. Are they going to be accessible after the webinar? And yes, they will be available on our YouTube channel. A link for that is also on the Facebook Live comments.
Absolutely. And so this webinar, we hope that you all continue to engage with these practices, these strategies around closing the school to prison pipeline and really creating environments for our students that is sustains their culture, sustains their identity, and that does not subject them to these exclusionary disciplinary practices that we know are going to lead them into the school to prison pipeline. So with that, I think unless there are any other questions that come through, we will go ahead. Oh, there is one more question that came through, so we're not going to end just yet. This is our last one. It looks like a good one. So one of our folks on Facebook Live asked us, said, knowing that exclusionary discipline and policing are the wrong thing to do, and actually implementing and supporting what school leadership and staff need to do better, i.e. anti-racist, culturally responsive restorative practices, is a different thing. How is IDRA meshing research and policy work to create conditions needed to actually change? And how can parents and community get involved? So in one of the ways that, thank you for that question, whomever you are, one of the ways that we mesh our research and policy work with our school work is, one, that we support parents and communities through a program we call our Education Cafe. We do leadership with parents and communities to help them understand the advocacy process. And so that's one of the ways, if you look on our website, you can find out more about our Education Cafe program. And that's one of the ways that we help not only explain what the policy and research is that we find, but we really try to value what the experience and the policy and the interests of our communities find, right? That's a huge part of our community engagement work, is making sure that we're valuing what parents and caregivers and students are telling us about their experiences. So it's not just, only working on policy and practice in the advocacy stage. IDRA also operates one of 4 federally funded equity assistance centers. So if there are school districts around the country that are interested in doing equity work, right, or related to race, religion, gender, or national origin, they can reach out to the EAC Center for the U.S. South, and they can say, we're interested in this project. We want to increase equity around school discipline, for example. We want to increase equity around emerging bilingual student access and engagement with those families. Can you help us, right? That's another way when we understand what the policy tells us, we're also able to work with school districts or local schools or state agencies that are working on these equity issues. And so it's important for parents to get involved. And those are 2 examples that I just gave, right? One with the schools, one just working for parents, but really is talking about these issues with other parents. Like I mentioned before, the best way to get involved is really just to start having conversations. And you don't need us at IDRA, you don't need any other organization that is around you to be involved in these conversations. You really just have to start talking to people. And once you get together, their three-pronged strategy, right? Organize, strategize, and mobilize. Once you all have gotten together, and IDRA wants to support you. If you're working on an equity issue, and there's a way that we can support you, we would love to do that. So thank you for that question. I think it's a really great thing for us to be thinking about as we close out this webinar. And we encourage all of you all to merge policy and practice with your own experience, to gather together, to really make policy and practice change, right? That's the goal of all of these things, is that we're not trying to train student behavior. We want to support our students, but more importantly, and another way for us to close the pipeline is really to address the policies and practices that have created this pipeline. And it's not going to go away on its own. It's only going to go away if we are dedicated and fight against it. So with that, I think that was our last question. I also, before we close, want to just invite you to other webinars like this. If you enjoyed this webinar, we've got some other ones coming up. Bricia, do you want to tell folks about this one?
Yeah, so IDRA funds a researcher every couple of years. I think we're in our third round, this researcher specifically does work on school finance. And so we put out a call for applications, we receive proposals, and we select somebody to be our school finance, our IDRA Jose Angel Cardenas School Finance Fellow. And our fellow for this past round, Dr. Cristobal Rodriguez, will be presenting his research tomorrow between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. And so we're going to have a panel with 3 experts and Cristobal, and it's going to be a great and informative webinar. And we also have in the red, drawing the line on digital redlining practices. And this is happening on October 27th from 11:30 to 12:30, 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. We also have school discipline and desegregation happening tomorrow, also October 20th, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we have a link to these 3 webinars for registration. The registration for all 3 of them, you can get to it from a single link, and that was put on the the Facebook Live chat right now. So click on those, register, and we hope to see you there.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all of you all that joined us. Please feel free to stay involved with us through our newsletter, as Bricia mentioned, through signing up to see more about our education cafes or our other policy work, and join our email list. All those things, fine. There are lots of ways to stay in contact with us, and we want to continue to support your work. But remember, at the end of the day, it's about our students, and we want to make sure that all of them are successful. So it's our job to help them and for students to be involved in closing the School-to-Prison pipeline. So with that, I will close our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please let us know if there's anything we can do in the future to support you.
Thank you so much, everybody.